Hi, this is Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington, and today I just wanted to talk about cracks. When they go all the way through, how to tell if they go all the way through, what's the safe bet? Well, so I got this guitar in, and this is a Gibson J45. It's a fairly new one. This is a guitar from probably like the mid-20 teens. But when we turn it over, we see this guy here, this crack that has occurred kind of along the player side of the headstock. Now, the customer that called me about this guitar had made mention that this had been into a shop, and that previous shop had thought that this didn't go all the way through into the wood. Now, I have pretty much just confirmed, actually, that is not the case. The reason that I will say that I've confirmed that that's not the case is because I've just taken all of the string tension off of this instrument, and I have noticed that it is closed. It was open before, and now it is closed, which tells me that the string tension, basically kind of pulling these tuner posts this way on top and pushing them this way on the bottom, was causing this crack to open as this bottom portion was being pushed outward. It was also noted by the player that they didn't notice that it had gone beyond the second tuner when they initially had brought it into that other shop. They had noticed that it did go into the second tuner. Now, there's a term for cracks that run along holes like this, and it's called a zipper crack. Now, typically speaking, zipper cracks are pretty common. Like if you see a crack on a headstock that's not like a broken headstock, typically it's going to be a zipper crack. Same thing with bridges. Same thing when you have like a series of holes in wood that kind of go along the grain. It's just kind of natural that crack would want to kind of travel up those holes like a zipper. That's why we call it a zipper crack. So, how do you tell, though? How do you tell, if this were a fresh injury to the instrument? How do you tell if this was, a major deal, like if it was down through the wood? Well, one would be to kind of flex it a little bit and kind of look and see if perhaps by applying very slight pressure to it, you can open it up and close it. That would be one way that you could kind of tell that it was down into the wood. Another way to tell if it's a crack that goes all the way through the wood, if it's like a soundboard or a side or a back, something that's a thin membrane of wood, is you can try to get something to travel through that crack. One of my favorite tricks to doing that is to take a little bit of naphtha and just kind of dab a little bit on the top of the guitar or on the side, wherever the crack is, wherever the suspected crack is. And if it's a crack, what will happen is that when you take the mirror and you look inside the guitar, you'll see a big wet spot that typically follows the line of that crack. So that's one way that you can do it. Another way that you can kind of tell in situations where, maybe things are a little bit more open but kind of hard to see. Specifically, kind of what I have in mind here is that sometimes you'll see kind of a little bit of a separation in here. Is you can take a feeler gauge and you can kind of poke at it a little bit. I don't necessarily recommend doing that if it's not like a separated glue joint, which is a little bit different than a crack. I mean, albeit, but I'm mentioning this here just because it'll probably come up in the comments. And you can see if you can get that feeler gauge, like an 005 or something really thin, and see if you can poke it in there and get it to penetrate. And if you can, then you know that that's actually a separated piece. All that being said, it is kind of tricky sometimes to tell if something is a crack or not. And, you may not have naphtha on hand. You may not want to risk flexing what you think might be a crack. Because if it's like a headstock crack, if you see like a crack around here, flexing that, might be the camel that broke the camel's, might be the straw that broke the camel's back, and you flex it a little bit and then it breaks, right? So, all of that stuff is really worth keeping in mind. This is one of those things that is maybe best left to professionals. And so, this is kind of a guideline that I'm giving y'all, that you can kind of check things out and kind of feel out for yourself on whether or not you want to bring it into the shop like right now or a little later. But if you have something that you suspect may be a crack, it's a good idea to at least bring that in and have it looked at. maybe it's due for a setup anyway, and you can bring it in and say, hey, can you check this out, and point out the area where the crack is. Usually when I bring a guitar in, I look for cracks. That's one of the first things that I do is I'll hold something up to the light and I'll really inspect it and see if there's something that kind of looks a little fishy. Just because I want to make sure that we're not doing like setup work on a guitar that needs like a crack repair, brace repair, something major structural like that. Because it's a waste of money to do a setup on something if it's just going to kind of shift when we do a repair. So, that's generally something that a repair shop should be doing, like right off the bat, and just in terms of general diagnostics when a thing comes in. Something that's also worth mentioning, too, is that nitrocellulose, which is what this guitar is finished with, and a lot of other guitars are finished with, tends to get this thing called crazing. And if you've looked at a lot of vintage guitars, you've seen crazing. Crazing is that kind of crackle effect where like there's a lot of little tiny cracks going all over the place and it looks kind of spider-webby. That's kind of a thing that nitrocellulose just does as it gets older, and especially if it's had a chance to get exposed to differences in temperature. Differences in humidity will also help with that, but differences in temperature are really what that finish is kind of sensitive to. So if you got like a guitar that's sitting in front of a door and you keep your house at like 70 degrees in the winter, and you open the door and it's like 20 below outside, like that's the sort of thing that can lead to crazing. But crazing also kind of makes it hard to detect those cracks because, if you're looking at something that's got all those little spider webs going all over the place, it's very hard to tell sometimes where those are cracks and where they aren't cracks. And oftentimes on vintage guitar, there will be cracks that are just kind of hidden there. There may be like little hairlines that you're not seeing. And what I'll say about that is that generally speaking, if something goes across the grain, I wouldn't worry about it so much. Not unless it's like a headstock or someplace that's known to kind of break off. Unless you think it's a part that is broken off, I don't think that typically it's really a big concern when you see those things that are going across the grain. But when you do see those crazing lines that follow the grain, particularly like if they really hug one of those dark grain lines, if you see something that's really kind of hugging that same kind of contour that the wood itself has, that's the moment where you can kind of get suspicious. And another thing with older guitars that you can kind of look at too is that cracks are gaps, and gaps tend to get dirty. And so if you're looking at something that you think might be a crack and it's got like a color to it, it's darker than the rest of the wood around it, it looks like there might be some dust, some grayness or something like that in there, that's definitely something that's worth looking at, because what that could be is that it could be that you have a crack there that hasn't been fixed, and what's filled that in is like, detritus from skin cells and oils and dust and whatever you have kind of floating around in the air in your house. And so, that's definitely something worth keeping in mind. So that's kind of my 2 cents on, what to look for and, how bad things might be. What I will say as far as like, whether or not to bring it in, if you see something that looks structural, like it's on the soundboard or it's in the neck or something like that, something that has, string tension directly applied to it, I would definitely detune that instrument, take all the tension off of it, take it to the shop immediately before doing anything else with it. Just because if it is a break, you don't want to be adding that tension to it, especially if it's an acoustic guitar, and kind of putting all of that, tension into something that may not be solid enough to take it right now. So this is the kind of thing that can cause like headstocks to kind of snap off without warning. Like maybe it took a fall and there's something there that maybe looks a little suspicious, but it's not, it's not quite through to what you think is the wood yet, but you go to tune it up and it just, kind of lets go. Same thing with like cracks on the soundboard or braces or things like that. That's the kind of thing that you definitely want to like get looked at immediately. If it looks like it's a structural problem, take it in. Cracks on like the side of the guitar, the back of the guitar, the biggest concern with those is that as cracks age, they tend to get bigger. And so it's good to fix cracks, sooner rather than later. But like stuff in the side, stuff in the back tends, and I mean tends, there are severe cases where this is not the case. They tend not to be all that structural, but they do affect tone a little bit. Sometimes they can cause rattling and buzzing and some other weird stuff. And again, they can spread and they can cause other problems. One of the problems that big cracks can cause is when they go and run into glue joints like braces and things like that, because they can contribute to braces coming loose and other things like that. So that's also a thing worth keeping in mind. So that's my brace talk, or my crack talk. You know, if you have any questions about it, you can submit those through Ko-fi if those are like kind of long questions. Prefer to get my questions that way. If you have something really quick, leave it in the comments here. I might get to it eventually. I do check my YouTube comments, but it tends to take a little while for me to have a day where I sit down and look at them. If you look down in the description of this video, you'll find a link to that Ko-fi, a link to my Patreon, and if you found this video particularly helpful and you want to throw me a few bucks through that, that's great. I really appreciate it. It helps me make these videos. I also have a link to my Reverb page down there that has instruments that I sell, sometimes parts that I sell, you know, good stuff. There's also a link down there to my website where you can find my pricing info and my contact info, and you can find a page that I wrote for caring for stringed instruments. And if you're watching this, I bet you have a few stringed instruments that you care for. Anyway, this has been Drew Jones of Drew's Guitar Shop in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for watching.